Let me talk about the topic for just a minute. The sign out front says sanctity of life, and the advertisement said respect for life. Bill sent out an advertisement that said respect for life from conception to the grace. I don't know if you saw the typographical error there, but it's supposed to say to the grave. And then you look at the outline here, and it doesn't say from conception to the grave. It says through old age. So maybe you're wondering, what are we going to talk about this morning? Let me just tell you, typographical errors aside, and he committed a typographical error just to prepare you for the typographical errors that are probably in my outline. So there probably are some. But I want to tell you that this topic is very complex, and it is, what I'm going to say, is fraught with what is probably almost an endless number of dangers. And because of this, I've tried to choose my words very carefully. During the question and answer period, you're probably going to find that I'll try to choose my words very carefully, because I want to be accurate, and I don't want to open this topic up to unnecessary wrangling about words. So I try to choose my words very carefully, not say what I don't want to say exactly what I want to say, and even then, there's probably going to be some wiggle room where I try to figure out exactly what we're talking about. And much controversy in this area is about words, and people defining words in ways that were never intended, and redefining words in order to say things that people don't know are going on. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And so there are a number of dangers that we face in this topic, and maybe during the question and answer period you'll feel some of those dangers. But I think that one of the greatest dangers is that there is a serious threat to approaching this topic in a calm and sensible and logical way. It is going to talk about some of the areas that we are most sensitive and illogical and emotional about. First, it's going to talk about some of the most intimate aspects of our bodies, most intimate aspects of our relationships, husband and wife, for example, pregnancy, and also some of the most intimate aspects of relationship in talking about our children. If you want to see people who are illogical, you oftentimes can look at parents and the way that they think about their children. And now, to be fair, I'm not being critical exactly. To be fair, I think that God gave us a natural love for our children that overlooks some of their flaws so that we will care for them. If we saw everything that our neighbors and our friends see about our children, we'd probably kick them out of the house a long time before we actually kick them out of the house when they're ready to leave the nest. We wouldn't be able to stand them. We'd quit feeding them, and we would just say, forget it. But we have this natural affection that, but unfortunately, that sometimes can blind us. And it sometimes blinds people who don't have children, who want to have children, people who have children, and are irrational either about them from a positive standpoint or a negative standpoint. And that causes some problems when we go and we step back and we say, what does God in His Word say about some of these topics? And so there's a good chance that some of the things that we talk about will step on your toes or on the toes of people that you talk to about this topic. At the very least, it may stretch you in your understanding or an application in some areas. It if nothing else, I hope that you'll go away from this calmly, logically, and say, I need to think about that some more, maybe do some more research, especially biblical research, about what's right on some of these topics. And so I'm hoping that we'll remain reasonable, resist the urge, in your outline I put, to follow in the steps of Pontius Pilate, who, when he came face to face with truth and the truthfulness of Jesus Christ, his rather rhetorical, flippant response was, "What is truth?" And then washed his hands and went on to do what he felt was most comfortable for himself and most politically correct. We need to try to avoid that. We want to avoid that, because as servants of God, what we want to do is we want to approach God with the attitude of, what do you want? So I want to start this lesson in a very odd way. Some of you are already looking ahead in the outline, maybe to look, hey, when do we actually start talking about the topic? Okay? I told my wife that I'm going to have trouble getting to the topic. And the reason for that is that the topic is not that difficult once you accept the common ground. The common ground is, number one, that we're going to accept that there is a God. I'm not going to spend time proving that, trying to establish that. I know, I've seen the announcements that there have been plenty of studies here on that topic. I'm sure they have recordings of them that you can listen to if you have questions about that. If you don't believe that there's a God, we'll talk about that in a little bit later, especially if you're talking to somebody who isn't a believer. We'll mention some things about that in just a minute. But this lesson is going to assume that we believe that there is a God and that Scripture is inspired by God. Okay, so that is accurate, and we have the will of God revealed in the Scriptures, in the Bible. If you have questions about that, we'll have to talk about that another time. We certainly don't have time to go into a strong defense of that today. And I'm not going to pretend to even do that today. We're going to start there. We're going to start there. If you have questions about that, Bill and some of the other members here, I'd be happy to address some of those things with you from a biblical standpoint. So we're going to build on that. God's people are dedicated to respecting, honoring, glorifying God in all that they do. And to do that, we have to do things like what 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 21 says. I love this verse, and I've spoken here a few times, and my guess is that I have actually addressed this several times. We're to test all things, hold fast what is good, abstain from every form of evil. That is our commitment as children of God. That's what we want. We want to, number one, abstain from every form of evil. We want to be in a relationship with God, and to do that, we're going to have to not do evil of any kind. Not big ones, not little ones, not whatever. There's no such thing as a white one or a black one to us. Every form is one that we want to abstain from. By the way, abstain. The just say no thing is not original with our generation. Don't do it at all. How do you do that, by the way? Well, God said we're going to have to test all things. We're going to have to stop, and we can't just say, I want to do it, or everybody's doing it. We're going to test it according to the will of God and see if it is His will. Now, that's the commitment that we have as God's people. We want to, as 1 Corinthians chapter 2 ends, have the mind of Christ. That means we want to think about things the way Christ thinks about things. That doesn't just mean we want to be happy like Christ is happy, or have peace like Christ has peace. It means we want to think, we want to judge things, we want to determine what's right, what the will of God is, like Christ does. This is a great chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 talks about, it's about Paul going to them and saying, I'm coming to you and I'm bringing you the revealed mystery. And this revealed mystery has been hidden, but now it's been revealed, and it's not just been revealed by us, the apostles and prophets, but by the Spirit of God, who didn't speak in men's words, but gave them the words, so that we can know the things that have been given to us of God. Because, and use the illustration, no man can know the things of a man except the man himself tell you, the spirit of the man tell you. You can't know what a guy's thinking. You can't know what a guy wants unless he tells you. Same thing is true with God. The Spirit searches the deep things of God, so God's Spirit has revealed the mind of God, so we can know. We don't have to wonder, what does God think about abortion? What does God think about euthanasia? What does God think about murder? We don't have to wonder about that, because God's Spirit has revealed those things so that we can think like God thinks about things, so that we can have the mind of Christ. By the way, that means that when we say this is right or this is wrong, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 11 says we can speak as the oracles of God. Speak as the oracles of God doesn't mean that I just come across as an expert. I speak confidently. No, it means that I can say that things are right and wrong as though God himself were saying it. How does that happen? Well, it only happens when we speak with the words that God gives. And by the way, he says in this verse, if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. What that's saying is that if whatever we're going to say and whatever we're going to do, it better come from God. And that's the only way to glorify God, is if we let God be God, that we accept that God always knows what is best. He always does what is best, and when we show respect for His things, we show respect for Him. I want to glorify God, and sometimes people think that glorifying God means that we just somehow come up with glorification ideas in our heads about what is good, what is right. God says, no. If you're going to speak, then you better speak like it's coming directly from me. If you're going to serve, it better be the things that I want you to do. Do not presume to know God's will. Keep me from presumptuous sins, the psalmist said in Psalm chapter 19 and verse 13. We don't want to presume that we know something, that something's good, that something's right, and sin against God. God thinks it's wrong, but I think it's fine. And I can't imagine why it's wrong. Doesn't matter if I can imagine if it's wrong or not. To presume that it's okay with God is unacceptable. I have to know that it is acceptable to God. And let me just warn you about something. You're going to see these warnings throughout the lesson, so I just kind of get used to them here. But we can desire to do the will of God, but when we make inconsistent application of His Word, of His will for our lives, it's going to cause others to blaspheme God in His way. 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 14. King David committed adultery with Bathsheba, and as a result of that, she became pregnant, and he had her husband murdered, and they did all this stuff to try to hide that. Nathan the prophet comes and reveals it, and David eventually confesses it. And in 2 Samuel chapter 12, Nathan points out that what David had done gave the enemies of God great cause to blaspheme God. What I find particularly interesting about this is is that sometimes when we mess up and when we do wrong things, when we make inconsistent application of God's Word, we think, well, people are going to look at me as a bad Christian. And that may happen. But actually what happens in reality is that then spills over in a big way toward God and His way. In other words, what David did, we should say, David, you were a bad man. But instead, the enemies of God were looking and saying, what kind of God does he have? God got the brunt of the criticism, of the blasphemy. In 2 Peter chapter 2, false teachers are going out and they're taking advantage of people and they're ripping them off financially and turning it into a way to raise money and to serve the flesh and be covetous. And it says, and many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed. 2 Peter 2 verse 2. So, who gets the criticism when the televangelist, is ripping people off? Religion is just a bunch of garbage. By the way, and God and the truth, and the Bible, the true church, it all goes in the trash can together with people like that. So we can just say, we don't need to speak against false teachers. We don't need to worry about them because we're not doing that. Peter says we're all going to get, the way of truth is going to be blasphemed. And by the way, the reason I'm pointing this out is not just because of preachers and teachers, but I'm going to warn you that the people that you're trying to influence on these kind of topics are watching your life. And when they see inconsistency in your life, they're going to say, oh yeah, you've got all the answers. You say that you're serving God in this area, but in this area over here, you do whatever you want. I'm going to do whatever I want in this area, and you do whatever you want in that area. People are watching. And the third warning I want to give you at this time is attaching God's name to something doesn't make it from Him or necessarily pleasing to Him. A lot of organizations today are attaching God's name to various different things, which you have to say, just because a church or just because an organization says it's right or wrong, doesn't make it so. Be careful about that. Don't get swept up because some organization says it's all right. Is it all right in the sight of God? We are committed to serving the one true God in His way. There's a lot of other reasons on this topic, on the respect for life topic. There are a lot of other inadequate reasons for doing or not doing things. And let me tell you something, that there are people on both sides that are using these kind of inadequate reasons, like financial concerns, economic, human resources. Do you realize how much, if there was no abortion, for example, how expensive that would be? Well, we can answer that and say, there's this group over here. Do you realize that if this group, if we would outlaw abortion, then these kind of financial things would be better? That just turns into a wrangling about it might be interesting facts. That's not going to prove it right or wrong. Quality of life, you hear those kind of arguments. This person is in so much pain, or this will bring so much pain into their life, or what kind of life will this child have? There's all kinds of interesting arguments. The college professor who told about this child that was born out of wedlock, and his mother had syphilis, and this and this and this, and they had no way. Should this child have been aborted? And they all go, yes. Vast majority, it turns out to have been Beethoven, who was the child. What's that prove? Well, it's interesting. People will say, maybe the person who has the cure for cancer has been aborted. The person who is going to come up with that. Maybe, maybe not. So we can argue about that. But if we can prove alone, I'm not sure that that accomplishes the financial, the quality of life arguments. Our culture accepts it, our culture doesn't accept it, our society has these kind of norms and has found it, there are some societies that don't accept it, but they don't really have an objective standard as to why they do or why they don't. What happens when the culture changes? And of course, feelings and emotional reasons are huge. The people, let me tell you something. Abortion is awful. I believe it's awful. But there are people who are trying to use emotional reasons to prove that it's wrong. Now, I think that people should feel emotion about abortion, should feel the horror of it. But the fact that you feel the horror of it doesn't make it necessarily wrong. Now, maybe it means stop and look at it. Stop before you do it. That this is a terrible thing. But it doesn't necessarily make it morally wrong in the eyes of God. I mean, we would think that, well, surely if I feel it's wrong, it's wrong. That's not necessarily true, because there are people who might say, I feel it's right, and it's right. There are people who look at the physical horrors of abortion and don't feel it's wrong. The doctors that do it. What do you do about that? That's not an adequate argument. Civil law, it's legal. I mean, if it was so bad, then why is it legal? We need to pass laws to make it illegal. I agree with that. Because I think that's part of government's job, is to protect innocent lives. But whether it's legal or illegal, for the person who's serving God, we have a higher law that supersedes that. And we have to show respect for that. So I want to warn you again that, conscience, we're talking about personal conscience, it doesn't bother me. Or it does bother me. The problem with conscience is that although conscience is important and valuable, it is only as good as it's trained. So there are people who can do evil with a clear conscience, and there are people who can't. Why is that? It's because conscience is trained. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, just by their culture, upbringing, or something like that. So let's talk. I'll give you another couple warnings, and that is that some invalid reasoning is logical if the errant original premise is accepted as true. If you accept that life doesn't begin at conception, then it logically follows that abortion is okay because it's no different than removing a kidney. Okay, that's logical. There are some logical things that are logical, but the beginning premise is wrong. So be careful, because sometimes we step into the middle of an argument and it sounds very logical all the way up here, and that's because steps B, C, D do follow one another. The problem is A is false. Be careful about that. Just because an argument sounds good or seems logical doesn't necessarily mean that it is right. And I'm going to tell you that these subjective standards that I just told you about, financial, quality of life, social concerns, feelings, civil law, personal conscience, they're all subjective. They do not bring unity. They cause unending arguments and inconsistent conclusions. In fact, you even see some who are defending respect for life changing their arguments over the years because they're using what I'm going to call inadequate arguments that have, oh, wait a minute, scientifically this is true, and then later they found out, well, that's not true, so now we have to change the argument. Well, if that's not true scientifically, and that's the reason it's wrong, then it's right. But we say, no, that's not right, so we just come up with another argument, and people see that. People see, wait a minute, you said this was the argument and you were hanging your defense on that, and now you're hanging on something else. You're not being honest here. What we need is an unchanging standard. And all those other ones change. When you talk to unbelievers, you might say, well, but you're talking to somebody, you're talking about standards of God's Word, and, not everybody believes in God. So what are you going to do about that? You're going to go and say, well, the Bible says, God says, and you say, well, I don't believe in God, so what am I going to do about that? Okay? First, from our perspective, you remember what 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 5 says. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. Now that means a couple things. Probably more than a couple. I'll talk about a couple. First, we do not have the right as God's people to stoop to using carnal weapons. No, you may not blow up an abortion clinic. Wrong. That's not how we fight. Not just because people get hurt and, there's property damage and things like that. Because God says that's not how we fight. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. Second, our arguments are not carnal arguments either. We are not going to argue from a carnal, physical perspective, even about a physical thing. This is very important. Okay? Now, that tells us something. That tells us that, yes, sometimes we are going to be talking two different languages. Because they're going to be talking, proponents of some activities are going to be arguing from a physical perspective, and we're going to be arguing from a standard that's based on something spiritual. Okay? And we may need to back up and show them that some of the facts that they give are not facts. So it's right to show physical facts and medical science, that's true, proven medical science, I believe is consistent with what God says about when life begins and things like that. And I'm okay. I think that it's all right that we can show some things about God and His creation, the truth about that. However, time and time again in the Scriptures, I just give you a few here from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, verse 25. It says that there are going to be people who are going to view the gospel as foolishness. In fact, verse 25 verse 14, of chapter 2 says that there will be times when they cannot know, they cannot understand from a physical perspective the things that are spiritually being taught. They cannot know them. So, number one, you just expect that when you approach this from the common ground, you're not always going to have that common ground of God's Word. And if somebody says, well, that's just foolishness, number one, don't be surprised by that. Okay? God said that that's going to happen. So you say, well, then how do we reach these people? I want to suggest to you that a starting point is that we need to talk to people instead of just getting down to the nitty-gritty about abortion. We need to back up and talk to them about the standard of morality. Without God, any discussion about morality, about values, about what is right and wrong seems to me to be senseless. You might say, well, that's because you believe in God. No. How can you say that X is good? How can you say that X is good or bad? I don't care which way you want to look at it. X is good or bad. How do you say that? If I say, well, it's good, pretty much any reason that I use is my prejudice. It's based on my background. It's based on my experience. You may have a different experience. Even if we say, well, you always do the loving thing. Is that always the same thing in the eyes of two different people? Are you kidding me? I was at the Shed Aquarium, and when I was at Shed Aquarium, They had a little desk, and you could do research and talk. And there was a woman sitting there who was a facilitator of some kind, and there was a little board there. There was a question that said, what is the shark's only predator? What animal is the shark's only predator? Whale, killer whales, dolphins, piranhas, who knows? Kids were walking up, and adults were walking up and answering all these questions. Wrong, 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 wrong. Nobody could get it. And I walked up to her and I said, are you including man as an animal? And she said, of course. And so I jumped over the desk and bit her on the leg. Now, why is that funny? Wait a minute, wait. Why is that funny? Why is it funny? If I act like an animal, I get kicked out, right? By the way, an animal that is a shark's predator, I was right, it was man. A shark's predator, if a shark bit us on the leg, you say, well, of course it's a shark, what do you think you're doing? But if it's a man, we expect something different. Why? I think that's where we need to start with people. That man is different, and that without God, there is no standard. God provides an objective morality. God makes it possible for something to be good, for something to be right, because it corresponds with fact. Something is not right just because I feel it's good. It's not wrong just because I don't like it. That's icky. It's wrong because it doesn't correspond with fact. God's will is not the origin of morality. Follow me on this one. It is morality because it's an arm or it's an expression of God's nature. I ask the question, is there any other possible, dependable, consistent, logical, alternative standard? Alternate standard? Is there another one? Anyone I come up with, people say it's flawed because it's what you like. It's what you want, or your loved ones, or the closest people to you. But God is objective. God doesn't make mistakes. So I think when we're talking to an unbeliever, rather than leaping into the undependable, inadequate reasons for something being right or wrong, we have to hold our ground and say, we have to consider what God has to say. I don't believe in God. I think that's, instead of saying, okay, we'll talk like an unbeliever too, we have to talk like a believer. Some won't listen and just say it's foolishness. Some, maybe we can talk to about and start with, how do you know anything's good? And we just keep backing them up until they don't have any reason for anything being good or anything being wrong. This is a lesson about respect for life. And so let's talk about what God says. Once you get there, once you say, okay, what does God say? It's not that bad. It's not that hard. God is our authority. Why? Why should he get to talk about this? He created all things. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. Run out of time as it is. Oh, wait a minute. I do want to talk to you for just a minute about an unlikely passage in 1 Samuel chapter 2. Unlikely and perhaps uncomfortable. 1 Samuel chapter 2, Hannah has prayed to God, asked for a son, and if you give me a son, I will give him to you. She's given a son miraculously. She had been barren up to this point, and she and her husband have a son, and she brings him to the tabernacle. Ever wonder how she felt when she brought him to the tabernacle? Oh, my boy, and I know how I would feel, because they didn't even live there, and they weren't going to see him maybe very often, and, what's ever going to happen to him? Listen to what she says. Chapter 2 is what she says when little Samuel is dropped off. The reason we know is verse 11. They go home. Okay? And the child stays. So verse 1, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. No one is holy like the Lord. There is none besides him, nor is there any rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. Real quickly, she says, listen. She says, God is God. I'm going to give him my son, and he's great. God's just great. I think she feels blessed and honored to make this sacrifice for God, because she sees how much blessing he's in. And for those of us who struggle with all the why questions and how could this happen and what about questioning God, she says, I'll tell you what. She says, don't you act proudly. She says, don't let arrogance come out of your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge. By him actions are weighed. Don't you dare weigh God. Don't you dare judge God based on what you think, what you feel, and how could he? Don't you dare do that. And don't you think you know more than God knows. Now, I've set you up. Yeah, that's right. Good, that's right. I've set you up because look at verse 6. She goes on to say, God does all this stuff. He makes strong men weak, and weak men strong. He makes hungry people filled, and filled people hungry. And then verse 6, the Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and brings up. Do you believe in a God who kills people? That's, by the way, one of the big stumbling blocks a lot of people have in the Old Testament. God kills a bunch of people. He kills people in the New Testament too. I don't believe that this verse is saying everyone who's ever been killed is killed by God. I don't think that's what it's saying. I think he's saying that it is within God's purview. It's within his ability. It's within his power. It's within his authority. His right to kill. To decide who lives and who dies. You believe that? If you don't believe that, not only do you not believe in the God of the Bible, you're going to struggle with a lot of things in the Bible, but also you're going to struggle with some life and death issues. Because God is going to dictate. God is going to say, don't kill. You can say, well, who do you think you are? It's the whole my body argument, right? Does God have a right to tell us what to do with my body or with the body of another person? What if I want to kill my own body? Can I do that? God says, that is in my hand to determine that. Some people reject God. Some people take the rights of God and usurp those and say, I'm going to decide, I'm going to do it. God says that's a sin. Hannah says, that's in God's realm. You let God decide those things. And so that's what we're going to do. That's what we need to say. So what do you say, God? From conception, from the point of conception, can we kill that? Or can we not? Which is it? Look at, some of these are going to be very, very well-known passages. Look over at Psalm 139. We're not going to look at them all. I gave you an outline because I knew that it would be hard for us to get through all of this. You can look at these passages yourself. Psalm 139, look at verse 13. You formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. Stop there for just a minute. Who was formed? The psalmist was. Me. It was me you were forming, by the way. He wasn't me until he took his first breath. He was me in the formation process, is what's happening here. And look at verse 16. Actually, on the board there, it should say verse 16. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed. And in your book, they were all written the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. Before I was ever born, before I'd lived any days in this world, you knew me. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed. This, my substance being yet unformed, is one word in the Hebrew. Very interesting. Those of you who know how to study some of the original language, very interesting to look at this Hebrew word. It's the only time it appears in the Old Testament. And it is a single word that means an unformed mass, an embryo or a fetus. I give you some references of some theological and word dictionaries that define it this way. It's defined, it's translated in various different ways: unformed body, unformed substance, things like that in various different translations. There's a couple interesting things here about this psalm. Number one, as we've already stated, David sees God involved in the formation process very early on. Sometimes we get the feeling pretty much like a creator. A man and a woman come together and we made a baby. It's true that men and women have some say in that. However, God says that there's a third party involved. And sometimes when we're trying to decide, should we keep this baby or not, should we abort or not, we forget that we're not the only one involved. Not only is there another person, a baby involved, but God is involved to say what's going on. And God says, I am informing this child within the mother. That's a very important thing. Because we forget that. We forget, well, we made a baby and we can unmake a baby. God says, I am informing it. I know this child. David says even, how far back do we trace it, though? And there are lots of questions about when life begins, when a soul is placed within a child. Some people think at the point of conception. Some think at the point of when the embryo implants in the womb. You know, some will move it much farther down. And abortions are allowed to happen very, very late in pregnancies now. And they are making a viability argument. You know, when a child can live without the support of its mother, or support of the uterus, that's the point when life begins. And that's pretty much the legal definition in most states now, unfortunately. What I would say is, although there's not a single verse that says life begins at conception, this verse 16 of Psalm 139, says that when David was in unformed substance, it was him and God was forming him. And we no longer have a say in that formation, whether it ought to go on or continue. Maybe I should say whether it would continue or not. God is now forming that child. And to say that now the formation is to stop is to say something that God has not said. God is the only one to stop it at that point. I don't know if I can make it any clearer. Some people have said, well, we don't know at what point the unformed substance in the pregnancy is being referred to. And my point is, well, whether that's true or not, then we have to say, as long as he's an unformed substance, then as far back as we want to trace it, which I have to trace it all the way back to conception, it's him. He's a living being. which we have no right to kill. And some of you have seen before that beyond the embryonic point, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, there are many verses that call unborn children children. Exact same word is used in the Hebrew for child. There's not a special word for unborn child as there is born child, birth child. I don't know how you're supposed to say that. Genesis chapter 25 and verse 21, Rebecca conceived and it says children, she had twins, the children struggled within her. Obviously this is later on in the pregnancy where she could feel the movement of the children and they were in there wrestling with each other, much to her consternation, I might add. But interesting, it's just an illustration of people being called children before they're born. They're also called babies or infants. Jesus himself, John the Baptist, in verses like Luke chapter 1, there's babe or baby. By the way, same Greek word is used for a baby in the New Testament before it's born as after, whether it's a newborn or an older infant. Look at the book of Exodus with me for just a quick moment here. Exodus chapter 21. Exodus 21. All these laws about what you do when this happens and when that happens, and it's not only religious law but also civil law that's being revealed for Israel. And over in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 22, it talks about if men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judge has determined. But if any harm follows, then you shall give, and notice that it says, life for life. And it goes on, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So, some guys are fighting with each other, and somehow, it spills over into the family, and a pregnant woman is harmed, and she goes into labor. It's possible to go into early labor and give birth, and there be no real harm done. The baby's fine, the mother's fine. But if death occurs, notice, if no harm occurs, there still could be a penalty paid, which could be determined, maybe like a monetary penalty. But if harm occurs, I want you to notice, life for life. I think that's interesting to me. I think the Old Testament law protected unborn life, whereas if an early birth happened and the child died, it was life for life. If not, I think they were all right if the child didn't die. And there's a lot of other verses that can be looked at where they're actually called mothers throughout the biblical times, whether the child was born or not. The word mother was used to determine that, showing God's attitude, and I think our attitude is supposed to be toward people who are with child. They have a child there. And it's not just an expectant mother in the sense you're going to be a mother. You are a mother, and the Bible treats them that way. Let me talk about a couple practical considerations, and I want to talk just briefly about older people. So these principles, I believe, make abortion generally wrong. And I say generally because I suppose, and I struggle with this a lot, there might be an exception, and I say might, when the unborn child and mother will die or are dying. I'm going to say say more about this in euthanasia a little bit later, but if there are some pregnancies that cannot continue because of where the embryo has attached, and the child will die and the mother will die. And so in that case, I suppose the death process it can't be stopped. And so an unborn child can be removed in a situation like an extremely, extremely difficult situation. Proverbs chapter 6, when in talking about the 6 things that the Lord hates, yes, 7 are an abomination to him. One of the first ones, one of the ones in there, hands that shed innocent blood. And I think that is not just about unborn children, that's going to spill over into other innocents whose lives are taken in the form of murder. But it's important to see in a pregnancy 2 persons. Because there are 2 persons. The Bible certainly treats it as 2 persons. It's not just my body anymore. There are 2 bodies involved in a pregnancy. The Bible sees it that the way God sees it that way. We need to see 2 persons there. And I warn you that advances in medical science involving the creation or conception of life and the ending of life don't change whether it's right or wrong according to God. We can rename it and we can put it in a laboratory or something like that. We have to back up. And what I'm talking about is that, first of all, remember science does not actually create life. Now, we created life in the test tube. It's never created life in the test tube. What they've done is that all they've done is taken life and combined it or manipulated it. That's all they're doing. Science can only show what is physically possible. It cannot show what is right or wrong or what should be done. That's all it can do. And so it's not sufficient justification to say, well, the Bible doesn't specifically mention blank. In vitro fertilization. Doesn't it specifically mention cloning? Look it up in your concordance. You know, it may be included in general biblical themes, or just because it's not wrong doesn't mean that it's right. We have to show that it's right in the eyes of God before we participate in it. And let me warn you of something else while we're at it. There are some wings of medical science that have redefined conception and contraception. And they include things that in contraception that destroy very early on embryos that haven't been planted in the uterus yet. So if you ask, is this abortive? They will say no. Because what they mean is they're saying that a pregnancy doesn't begin until implantation in the uterus. I don't believe it begins at conception. So something will be labeled as a contraceptive, but it doesn't stop conception, it stops implantation. You need to be careful about that. So some birth control pills have a secondary mechanism that can impede implantation if fertilization still happens. If you ask your doctor, is this abortive, he'll say no. But if you say, is there a secondary mechanism that if I do get pregnant anyway, that it's going to change the alignment of the uterus and I'm not going to be able to, it won't be able to implant, he'll tell you. He might tell you yes. So you need to know the right kind of questions to ask. Most in vitro fertilization and attempts at cloning conceive embryos and then kill them. They dispose of the weak ones, the damaged ones, or the unneeded ones. Not to mention unnecessarily, in my opinion, unnecessarily risking the lives of the embryos that they are transferring. So we have to learn to ask the right questions, not just settle for one that a friend or a doctor or some pharmaceutical company or some support organization just kind of throws out, no, it's okay, don't worry about it. It's not abortive, and we have to, sometimes that's what we want to hear because of convenience or because something that we really, really, really want to do. So we have to be careful and ask the right questions. So what I want to do is, and technically I think we're out of time, but I want to show you I didn't say, I also changed the title from birth through old age rather than from birth to the grave, because the grave can come anytime. In fact, I can send you to the grave. So I wanted it through old age to be more technically correct. And the fact of the matter is that all down through history, the killing of innocents has been murder. That's it. It's murder. Don't do it. And there are consequences. You know, if you talk about Cain in Genesis chapter 4, in the days of Noah, it talks about, not to spill human blood, and the consequences to that in Genesis chapter 9. There's Moses in Exodus chapter 20. That's the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. Technically, it's the word, you shall not murder. Christ in Matthew chapter 5, again, recounts the murder prohibition, and the apostles. And what's interesting is that when we get to the New Testament, most of the letters are written to Christians who would already have accepted and known that murder was unacceptable. When Paul writes the commandments in Romans 13, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there's any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Bottom line is that when you teach a gospel of love, then you can't include murder in that. There's no way that murder is an extension of loving your neighbor or doing no harm to your neighbor, as well as all those other things. Stealing, God didn't just sit back in history and say, let's make stealing wrong. I think, yeah, that sounds good. Let's make stealing wrong. Or committing adultery. Let's make committing adultery wrong. Or murder. That's not what he did. What he did is that he saw that those things are inconsistent with who he is and his love and doing harm to other people. He says, don't do that. And so he's delineating the things that are inconsistent with doing good to others. And suicide is generally self-murder, and it is not condoned by God in any form that I can find in the Scriptures. In fact, there are several examples of suicide in the Bible, and they're all done by sinful people. Maybe an argument could be made that some of them maybe weren't in their right minds, but generally speaking, they were sinful people, not exactly a good example to follow. Let's talk for just a minute. Well, then what about suffering? There are some bad things and some suffering, and what about the mercy killing and all that kind of stuff? Surely there's got to be a way to get out of that. Well, let me tell you, the Bible takes a very different approach to suffering. Verses like Acts chapter 20 and verse 35, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 14, approach suffering from the perspective of supporting the weak, helping those who are, giving us an opportunity to serve. None of us want to be the person that gives the other person an opportunity to serve. I want to be able to walk. I don't want you to have to carry me. But you carrying me may give you an opportunity to serve, not only to show your love for me, but show your love for God. Understand that. That gives you an opportunity. Some of the greatest pictures of suffering in the world have given some of the greatest opportunities for other people to show their love for others, for God, and for serving. Of course, the Bible talks quite a bit about the fact that during times of trial, it gives us opportunities to grow personally. And again, none of us want to grow in patience because suffering's in our life. But James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 says that's one of the ways that it comes. Maybe the only way that it comes. So it can bring spiritual strength, spiritual maturity to us. Have you ever wondered why Job didn't kill himself? Most of you know the story of Job. He longed for death. He thought death would be better than the life he was living. Why did he kill himself? Why didn't some of his friends that came and were trying to help him, why didn't they just kill him, mercy kill him? Why didn't they kill him? He wasn't far from death, it sounds like to me. Wouldn't have taken much. But there was a reason. We may prefer death, but Paul said in Philippians chapter 1 that Philippians chapter 1 that he was kind of between a rock and a hard place, where he didn't know which he would choose, to die to go be with the Lord, or to stay there, which was useful to the people who he was teaching and preaching to. Why didn't he just kill himself and go to heaven? Because that wasn't in his hand. That's not in man's hand to choose that. God, he said, he was confident was going to leave him there to continue his work. That's because it's God's choice. And it's hard in the middle of suffering to remember Romans chapter 8 and verse 18 that says, "So I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." It's hard for us to keep that. But in our mind during intense suffering. But the fact of the matter is, this is the more than conquerors chapter. You know that. And so he's saying we can do what's right. We can survive. God's not asking us to do more than we can do. And if we're stuck in a bed, then be the very, very best Christian you can be stuck in a bed. If you have cancer, be the very, very best. Show what a Christian with cancer looks like. That's all God asks us. And well, how do I get beyond the suffering? He says, what you do is that you remember the glory that you're going to a place where there's no suffering, there's no pain, and your faithfulness now is going to bring that glory. Some practical considerations in this area, euthanasia. That's from the Greek word a Greek word that's combined from the Greek good death is what that word is from. Assisted suicide, death with dignity, mercy killing, it's wrong, it's immoral, it's sinful, it's murder. I suppose there's a difference between euthanasia and allowing someone to die via natural processes. I suppose not every extraordinary means must be taken in every single situation. Death occurs and we can be allowed to die. That's not the same as giving me an injection or cutting off my food source or putting a pillow over my head or putting a gun to my head because I just don't want to suffer anymore. And advances in medical science and technology can sanitize some of these things and make them seem very, very palatable, not so bad. And I'm going to warn you that the end is still death. And that's what we're looking at. It's still death. It's still wrong for man to intentionally bring that about. So we need to show respect for God in all these things. He is almighty. You are not. He's the creator. He knows what is good. He knows objectively what is best. He is free from external and internal influences and prejudice. You are not. He is Lord. He has the position. He has the authority. He has the power. You do not have. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19. You are not your own. Glorify God with your body and with your spirit, which are God's, he goes on to say. That's our job. Our job is to use what God has given us to bring him glory, and we do that not by dying a death with dignity. In fact, some of the people who are some of the greatest servants of God did not have a very dignified death. It's not about that. It's about serving. It's about serving God and doing his will. And finally, there are eternal consequences to not listening to God. We will be judged according to the things done in our body. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10 says. So we might say, well, who cares? God, who cares? God says you're going to care because you're going to be judged based on the things that you've done here. Now the good news is, and you know the word gospel means good news, is that no matter what we've done, we can be washed, we can be sanctified, we can be justified in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, talks about the fact that no matter what you've done, in fact, it tells us some of the Corinthians had done some of these sort of things. You can be forgiven. I don't care how long you've done it, how many times you've done it, who you've done it to, done it with. God says you can be